Welcome to News from Neptune for October 11th in the 41st week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in the aftermath of World War I, said, quote, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism, in Karl Marx's sense, in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared in the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism, close quote. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes who called themselves socialist made immense strides in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I, with the help of J.B. Nicholson, will try to say some true things on a ending U.S. war, ? Edition of News from Neptune. We're dealing with the Trump derangement syndrome in American politics. That's a new series, by the way. Mainstream media is concentrating on Trump's character to distract from criticism of ongoing U.S. policy, except where Trump can be blamed for it, especially war policy, which means the clearest accounts are coming from unlikely sources, including, as Jeff Nicholson reminds us, the Jimmy Dore show on YouTube. And remarkably enough, as Jeff has also noticed recently, the Tucker Carlson show. There's flashes of sanity and insight turning up on the Tucker Carlson show. So that's on Fox News. So odd things are happening all over, and some of the oddest are found in mainstream media. Donald Trump on Wednesday said, quote, "The United States has spent $8 trillion fighting and policing in the Middle East. Thousands of our great soldiers have died or been badly wounded. Millions of people have died on the other side. Going into the Middle East is the worst decision ever made in the history of our country. We went to war under a false and now disproven premise, weapons of mass destruction. There were none. Now we are slowly and carefully bringing our great soldiers and military home. Our focus is on the big picture. The U.S. is greater than ever before." Close quote. Now, translating that from the Trumpian,
but that kind of sounded non-Trumpian. That sounds more like, I mean, if he said it, fine.
Exactly.
But it sounds like somebody scripted him to say that because it doesn't have all the usual Trumpisms in that statement that you just read.
And in fact, the statement I just read was tweeted in the middle of the week by the real Donald Trump, as he says, and the chances that it was someone else, I think, is fairly small.
Okay, fair enough.
And it's exactly the peculiarities of that comment that I wanted to begin with tonight, because the implications for American policy have been seized on and manipulated by mainstream media quite remarkably. There are people, insightful commentators, who see what's going on. One of the best, I think, is Pepe Escobar, who writes for Asia Times. He commented, quote, speaking of this the comment that I just quoted, he says, "This has got to be one of the most explosive outbursts ever by a POTUS, by a president of the United States, no less. When Trump tweets truth, yes, it does happen, it's always astonishing. No way natural-born killer Obama would ever admit to the obvious. No wonder this $8 trillion tweet has sent the war party bonkers and predictably has been buried by mainstream media." Now, I think that's right. When he refers to the $8 trillion tweet, he's talking about Trump's description, which I just read, of how the U.S. has spent that sort of money killing people in the Middle East for reasons that do not bear serious examination. They have to do with the economic hegemony of the American 1%. There are indeed problems and difficulties with that comment of Trump's, but they're not being rationally or reasonably discussed. One of the better comments, or one of the better critical comments, came from Tulsi Gabbard, the presidential candidate who is carefully being excluded from the run-up to the presidential primaries by the Democratic National Committee. Gabbard says, and it's debatable and arguable, but at least it's something that should be debated and argued, unlike most of the comments about Trump. Gabbard says, "Trump is not removing our troops from Syria. He's just moving them from one northern Syrian border, allowing Turkey to invade Syria and slaughter the Kurds. He lied to the Kurds, promising them our support, while simultaneously preventing them from reconciling with the Syrian government and coordinating a common defense against the Turkish invasion. In short, the impending slaughter and ethnic cleansing of the Kurds in northern Syria by Turkey is happening because Trump refuses to end our efforts to overthrow the Syrian government. The Kurds are just another casualty of this regime change war, which is supported by warmongering Republicans, Democrats, and the corporate media. And we might add by all the presidential candidates, with the exception, perhaps, of Tulsi Gabbard. The hypocrisy, this is Gabbard's statement, continuing, the hypocrisy of warmongers like Nikki Haley, Senator Graham, and others who have demanded that we continue our regime change war in Syria, who are now crying crocodile tears for the Kurds, is nauseating. Starving the Syrian people through draconian sanctions, strengthening terrorists like AQ and ISIS, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, wasting billions of dollars, creating a refugee crisis, and now this impending genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Kurds, the warmongers considers these costs to be a small price to pay in their efforts to change the Syrian regime. Question: why is the U.S. political establishment so hysterically trying to get rid of Trump? Answer: they fear that he may end the endless war in which the U.S. has killed more than 20 million people since World War II. The economic hegemony of the American 1% depends on war, spending for preparation for war, and war provocations to trammel up potential economic rivals, notably Russia and China. Obama inherited two shameful wars from the Bush administration in Afghanistan and Iraq. He increased the number to 8, attacking Libya, Pakistan, the Philippines, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen as well, notably with drone assassinations, and became the first U.S. president ever to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. Not even President Roosevelt in World War II, Wilson in World War I, or Lincoln in the Civil War did that. Obama bequeathed these wars to Trump. But now the U.S. political establishment fear that Trump cannot be relied upon to continue that war policy. They're determined to see that he does so or is replaced by someone who will. But they can't do this openly. They can't say that this is really what we're doing, what we're concerned about here. So they have to say, as someone put it the other night, orange man bad. And that's the extent of their criticism. There's a lot to be said about this, but it seems to me that the overall question that we should be asking right now is, will the endless war that is the desire and the effect of the American political establishment, in fact, be inhibited in any way at all, even by someone so unlikely as Donald Trump? What's on your mind, David?
A few months ago, the astute commentator who you never heard of named Benjamin Studebaker, and yes, he is a Studebaker. He is a South Bend, Indiana.
Yes, indeed.
Which is something I can go into later.
Uh-huh.
He commented that ever since Watergate, ever since Bob Woodward, there's been a kind of a pipeline between dissident, quote unquote, dissident civil servants, and by that he means mostly spooks, mostly CIA agents or people working in that field, or the general field of what's called intelligence. There has been a pipeline between them and journalists like Bob Woodward, or most notably Bob Woodward in all of his books, in order to make sure just what you're referring to here. Okay, that's one thing I'll put on the table. I think that was an episode of a podcast that I'm going to refer to maybe a couple more times in this program called "What's Left," that this fellow Benjamin Studebaker does with a very astute Australian woman named Amy Therese, T-E-R-E-S-E, which you can listen to on all the usual podcast outlets. It's not for everyone probably, but it's at this point my favorite one because I think they're speaking truth. And of course, what I mean by that is they're confirming my biases. Along those same lines, Counterpunch has, I think, this morning, more than ever, officially gone to the dark side in these matters. People like Paul Street,
yes,
Anthony DiMaggio, not of baseball fame,
no,
and Andrew Levine and others have, in their more high-minded leftist way, basically reassured us that Trump should be impeached, and that we need to separate the fact that liberals are bad and Democrats are bad from the fact that Trump is horrible, the people who support Trump are fascists and white supremacists and white racists. And I don't really see any pushback on the Counterpunch website in regard to that. I know that Carl, this week there was an article by a fellow named C.J. Hopkins, who used to write on Counterpunch, who now writes on the Medium website, which is where anyone can write,
right, but
of course isn't as widely read. I know that Counterpunch, in their favor, is to their favor, published an article of mine a week ago Wednesday about the whole Jeffrey Epstein, Nicholas Kristof thing, which I spoke about on our last program. It's been 2 weeks since we did one, and I donated to them. I mean, I kind of felt like, well, you publish my stuff, and I should support you, and you should. I mean, Counterpunch should continue to exist as a primary outlet for left-wing thought, but they're perilously close to becoming just one more liberal left outlet promoting Trump derangement syndrome, a form of identity politics, and various other parts of this syndrome to which I note the various confirmation biases regarding race, gender, and so forth, and also immigrants. That's one of my. I spoke about that on the last program, and so this is where we're at now. The rubber is really hitting the road in regard to the Trump, the Ukraine gate, the Trump impeachment process, the manner in which people are lining up for that. And I also know, Carl, that you, I don't know if you noticed this or not, but under C.J. Hopkins' Medium article, Louis Proyect did a post, and then you commented on that post on his Mark's Mail list. So I know we're dealing with, Louis Proyect publishes on Counterpunch, and that's probably neither here nor there in terms of what he actually writes on Counterpunch. But on his own Unrepentant Marxist website, he is certainly symbolic of the movement, this strange combination of Marxism and identity politics.
Cool.
So it's a strange world we're living in right now. And it's kind of in flux. And of course, things are going at kind of rapid speed, both because of Trump, of Europe, of the Middle East, and because of the Democratic Party, presidential primaries and everything that's being sort of read into that.
I think it simply illustrates once again the insight of Rosa Luxemburg's remark we start the program with, the importance of saying accurately and loudly what's actually going on. And it's not easy. And I must admit, in 30 years and more of doing this sort of political commentary in the media, I've never seen a time when it's been harder to try to say clearly what's happening over against the obfuscations, conscious and unconscious, put forward by the regnant discussion, mainstream media, if you like. It's a mess.
Yeah, and it extends to the local context in trivial ways, but it's all part of the same thing. It's all part of the same blob of people not wanting to say what is happening, and along with that, either not providing data or misusing data in ways that are just that make it impossible to understand what is going on. For instance, what is going on this campus, at the U of I campus? Some people had a meeting in which they talked about Israel and Palestine. Some true things were likely said about Israel and Palestine at this meeting. It was reported that true things were said about Israel and Palestine, and that the feelings of some of the Jewish students who may have attended this meeting, which was not like a Students for Justice in Palestine meeting, but was under some kind of multicultural auspices within some diversity oriented department that's supposed to get kids together to talk about what's going on in the world. So we have these heavily policed, state-sponsored spaces in which certain true things just can't be said. Of course, one of those is about Israel and Palestine, what actually is going on there. Predictably, charges of anti-Semitism are being made. The Daily Illini is talking about them. The News Gazette is talking about them. And we're not talking about Israel-Palestine. And what we see here is the heavy policing of state-sponsored spaces by Robert Jones and the other diversity policers in the U of I, administrative status. And are we going to see Jim Dye of the News Gazette, who is generally skeptical of this, what he considers the spinelessness and coddling of the spinelessness of U of I administrators, and the coddling of students who can't have their ears reddened by any truthful things. Well, when it comes to Israel and Palestine, Dye has never stood out as one who's willing to really apply his alleged principles of free speech to that particular issue.
We're talking about a columnist and reporter for the News Gazette, who, once again, I have to admit is a personal friend, and as the major, in fact, the only practitioner of investigative journalism at the News Gazette on those stories which are simply not reported elsewhere. If you want to know about what's happened to a corrupt judge in the state of Illinois, you will not find it, I think, in any other local media, but Jim will have the details, and the stories are often not very attractive, shall we say. So it's important to have him there. I agree with you on his sometimes objectionable accounts.
Well, I don't. I mean, I'm not a big fan of all this legalistic research he does, but that's his thing. So fine,
I think it's important, and it's a thing that seems
but
to
there's
me
plenty of things he could
local
be
press should be
there's
doing.
plenty of things he could be researching into. But the person who wrote the story in the News Gazette this morning was Julie Wirth, and she basically just as she always did, basically just repeated the talking points of the U of I administrators, and referred to, this was the kind of story that simply reflects prevailing views about political correctness, alleged anti-Semitism, the idea that we just can't have people saying mean things about other groups of people or implying mean things about other groups of people. The truth beneath that doesn't really matter. And what's interesting about her story is that the representative of the Jewish people in this instance was the Chabad Rabbi Tichtel, who has become kind of the de facto go-to representative in a strange way of Jewish people. This is a man who supports Israeli settlements. This is a man who supports Israeli apartheid. This is a man who supports the relationship between, religious Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, and Israel and settlements. So this is not someone who should be put up as this sort of quaint political figure telling us that we've been victims, and there's this beyond the fact that this incident doesn't mean anything in terms of anti-Semitism. The incidents with the noose in the elevator in Allen Hall a couple of months ago, which Jim and I did report on skeptically properly, doesn't mean anything about anti-Semitism. Nothing that's going on in this country means anything that there was an upsurge of anti-Semitism. But the data doesn't matter. You just look at the ADL website and one of their stupid heat maps and all their reports, which are never verified. So we're supposed to believe that along with Donald Trump came, again, it gets get back to Donald Trump, this upsurge in anti-Semitism, which doesn't exist, or this upsurge in racism, which there's some evidence for in relation to maybe the things Trump says about immigrants. Okay, but there's just so much here that isn't verified, that isn't understood, and they can't be said. And of course, once again, we're hiding behind accusations of anti-Semitism to avoid the fact that A, truth is being told, and B, there's bad stuff going on in Israel and Palestine, which respectable people support. All these people who say that they're opposed to this and that, well, they're still supporting Israelis killing Palestinians, killing Palestinian children.
And in terms of the discussion, it seems to me that those of us who feared that the rise of identity politics would have the effect of masking a real discussion of what's going on in American politics and indeed in world politics, were right. And we're seeing more and more examples of that these days. That can't be said as a technique of any form of social control, and we pride ourselves in America of being insulated from that. Our First Amendment tradition supposedly means that you really can't get away with saying that can't be said on political and social views, however objectionable they might be. But we're doing it. It's happening. It's working its way across the political discussion, and the colleges have been one of the major places for it. If you want to give an account of what's going on, in colleges right now, you have to go back at least to the opposition to the Vietnam War 2 generations ago. The American educational system was taken by surprise by the opposition to the Vietnam War that burgeoned on American campuses. And they made very sure that such a thing would not happen again. And one of the subtler ways of making sure that such things don't happen again is the rise of identity politics, that offensive matters cannot be said in public without reprisals being taken by the institutions, including most notably universities. Some amazing things have happened as a result of that, and those people who objected to American crimes in Southeast Asia 50 years ago would be the first to be appalled at the sorts of things that have been done on the basis of that.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to fit in here, because I wanted to do it in the last program, and it relates to the News Gazette coverage of their weekly entry into a salute to those who served.
Oh, yes.
And Paul Wood doing interviews, and there's been some interesting developments on that, including a kind of strange interview with our friend Meg Miner, who stood with us in opposition to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But that aside, one thing that really I noted in a couple of consecutive Paul Wood entries was that he quoted a former Vietnam serviceman as coming home from Vietnam and being spat upon by a guy at the airport and then having decked him. And Paul Wood simply quoted verbatim what this man was telling him, what a man somewhere in, I think Vermilion County, had told him. And the thing that, we've talked before about this mythology of soldiers being spat upon, the work of Jerry Lemke in that regard, in a book called the Spitting Image, and so forth. And he's also there's another interesting podcast called Working Class History, which he's been interviewed on within the last year or so. But anyway, I thought it was a kind of fascinating, remarkable thing that this fellow, who almost highly unlikely, who this almost certainly didn't happen to, believes this happened to him. I want to ask you about that, Carl. He believes this happened to him. How did he get to believe that this happened to him? And because I know I can't say for sure that it didn't happen to him. There's never been any kind of verified instance of this actually happening to anyone, and it's a highly implausible story. But Paul Wood just reported it as fact, and that's part of a larger issue that we have about the way Vietnam is being looked at through his columns as well as through obviously other ways, and it just piles upon this whole idea of what is happening. Were people being spat upon? In this case, it usually was the myth has to do with sort of hippie girls spitting on soldiers. In this case, the guy claimed it was a male who spat upon him, and that doesn't feed into that whole archetype. But anyway, just had to get that off my chest. He believes that, because of the manner in which our culture works and the manner in which it deals with certain historical issues, people come to believe that stuff happened that didn't happen because they've heard that it happened, and then they feel like they've actually experienced it themselves. Did he dream it? I mean, how do you have any clue, Carl? I know I'm asking. It's not fair for me to ask you that. But
what I'm reminded of is George Orwell's remark in 1984, a thematic remark for that still remarkably prescient novel, that he who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. what we're watching on stories like that, however they're reproduced by people who believe them or simply repeat what they've heard as truth, what we're hearing there is the control of the past, the control of the great crime that the U.S., the memory of the great crime that the U.S. performed in Southeast Asia, the control of that as a matter of controlling the future, of making sure that the sort of objections to the Vietnam War, which, remember, were remarkably effective at the time. By the late 1960s, an overwhelming majority of Americans thought that the war in Vietnam was not just a mistake, as the government occasionally said might have been right, but they thought it was a crime. That's the sort of thing that scared the guardians of public memory, including the News Gazette, in this country. And that's what had to be dealt with. The rest of Orwell's quote is that he who controls the present controls the past. And it's the fight for the control of the past, the fight for the understanding of the opposition to the war and what it was about, that's at stake here. The attempt to try to say that they were just a nasty people who spat at soldiers who objected to the Vietnam War completely misrepresents the facts, completely misrepresents the overwhelming opposition to the crimes the U.S. was committing in Vietnam. The phenomenon has a name. It was spoken already a generation ago as the Vietnam Syndrome. The Vietnam Syndrome was the conviction amongst Americans that the horrible things that the U.S. had done in Vietnam should not be repeated. And American planners found this a difficulty because it was hard to get other wars going, wars in the interest of the American 1%, because of the revulsion of the American public against what happened in Vietnam, or what the U.S. did in Vietnam. That had to be neutralized some way before we could go off and repeat it. And it's no accident that the people who understood that situation were the Bushes, father and son, responsible for the greatest crime of the 21st century so far, repeating what we did in Southeast Asia, in Southwest Asia, that is, the invasion of Iraq. It was the elder Bush who said after the first Iraq War that the importance of the first Iraq War had little to do with Saddam Hussein or Kuwait or any of the issues at stake there. The importance was we've kicked the Vietnam Syndrome in the head, said George Bush Sr. That is, we've gotten rid of that American revulsion at American foreign policy crimes, and therefore we can go on and commit them. Incredible and quite remarkable, but in fact prescient, because his son then set out on the invasion of Iraq that killed 1 million people and repeated that imperialistic activity that got us into Vietnam, but now without the opposition that Vietnam had engendered in the American people. This is how these things are carried out, and controlling the narrative is crucial. It's absolutely central. He who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. That's the Orwellian, in both senses, comment that describes the situation we find ourselves in.
The week after Paul Wood interviewed this guy who said that he'd been spat upon when returning to an airport, which military soldiers didn't even return to actual public airports, but which is part of this whole fable. The week after, he interviewed another Vietnam vet, and Paul Wood is on the case. He wants to know, how were you treated when you got back? And this other guy said, "Oh, I was treated fine." Yeah. And Paul didn't get what he wanted out of this guy. Maybe he wanted at least confirmation that this spitting upon thing might have happened to more than one people, but it most likely never happened. So I'll put aside my fascination with human psychology as to why people believe stuff happened to them that never happened to them. I don't want to so much pick on this one guy because he's part of a whole, obviously, political, cultural phenomenon. But still, there is this desire to revise the history of that, when in fact the returning soldiers were treated well by the anti-war movement because the soldiers were likely to be anti-war themselves.
And that once again goes back to the understanding in the popular mind today of what Vietnam was all about. There was a peculiar reference to that in this morning's paper. And I must say, parenthetically here, that for all our comments about local media mavens like Jim Dye and Paul Wood, they of course have an open invitation to come in and talk to us about it anytime they want to.
I think they're at the door right now.
Well, that would be an interesting development.
I thought I heard a faint knock. Don't be shy, guys. Come on in.
I think, yeah. I don't know whether a faint knock is quite right.
I can't even imagine what a conversation with Paul Wood would be like. I can't even imagine. Jim Dye I could kind of imagine, but...
No, we've known both of these people, for actually, one way or another, for a good number of years. But the point here is this understanding of where we are and what we're doing, the narrative, as we say, of what American politics is like. And that's the thing that strikes me as both most dangerous and most effectively manipulated in a way that as I've ever seen it. I grew up in the McCarthy era, and the politics of McCarthyism in Cold War America, the beginning of my political education. And even then, one knew that there were problems, at least, with the narrative. I have never, in all the intervening years, seen the narrative so remarkably controlled by mainstream media and being so false. And that seems to me to be very dangerous. Dangerous as anything else that's going on in the current discussion. People say, well, the difference is now we have social media and so forth to talk about these things. Well, perhaps, but the result is a national discussion which is more fantastical in the literal sense of the term, more made up, more misrepresentative of what actually is going on than I've seen in a long lifetime of reading the papers.
Yeah, I'm seeing the acronym PMC being used a lot lately in structural discussions of our class system, professional managerial class. So I think it's worth noting, at least in passing, as much as we talk about the 1%, the 0.1%, the billionaires, whatever. We're talking in this country, and especially in relation to the Democratic Party primaries, I think, and this fascination with Elizabeth Warren, this awful woman who is really no better than Joe Biden, if not worse, that the professional managerial class is looking for someone that sort of at best 10%, the top 10% outside of the next 9% or the next 9.9%. They are looking they are concerned that their society, their vision of this meritocracy isn't going the way it should be going. That the basket of deplorables is getting deeper and wider, and that the people aren't just going to vote for the people that they put up for them. This professional managerial class who supports these versions of identity politics, and who go to the best schools, and who life is pretty good for. They're just concerned that something is happening that is messing with the future that they see for this country. And the main problem is they don't have an idea of now how they're going to get the votes to put their kind of person into the White House. And their kind of person is definitely not Donald Trump. It's not Bernie Sanders. And they're looking around in this process, in this presidential primary process, all the back and forth, this debate process, to focus on somebody who will represent their interests, and their interests, of course, serve the 1% and the 0.1%. So this is what we're in the middle of, and everything we talk about race and racism, gender, transgender, everything, war, Israel, Palestine, everything has to be filtered through this PMC lens, and so that we understand the right way of looking at the world, so we can get the right people in to keep things just kind of moving along in a way that doesn't threaten anybody's interests, but we can pretend that we're opposed to climate change. We believe in it. We're opposed to it. We don't need to make any of the fundamental changes to really deal with it, but we're good people.
What's Hillary Clinton doing these days? Is she available?
It's Elizabeth Warren is seen as somehow being superior to Hillary Clinton, a little better in this kind of wonkish way, a little more to the left. And the more that I read and hear about her, the more that I learn about her past, she is some character. She is some liar. She is some phony and some fraud. You cannot trust this woman to represent any enlightened view of the future of this country. And the Democrats are just going to get that back into the same Hillary Clinton issue that they had in 2016 if they put her up. I know they're looking to say, okay, Biden isn't going to make it, but she can, and these other candidates just don't have the polling numbers and don't have the whatever. So she's their woman, and so we have to start to oppose her.
You mentioned earlier C.J. Hopkins' remarkable piece from a week ago. It's called Trumpenstein Must Be Destroyed. I thought it was one of the best overall descriptions of our present political situation that perhaps your PMC cohort has got us into. The problem with it was that it was cast in a satirical tone that takes a minute or two to break through to understand. I'm going to post it again to the Facebook page for News from Neptune because it's the best general comment on this situation that I've seen in the last couple of weeks. I'll put that up there and see what we get to it.
Just to make it, just to put a point on that, C.J. Hopkins was basically kicked off the Counterpunch website for whatever reason.
I think, in fact, that perhaps misrepresents the. I think. How do I want to say this? I think the problem may have been personal rather than political.
Okay.
That there's not finally that much difference between the editorship of Counterpunch that we've been speaking of, and the problem is that we're talking here about people who include personal friends. Hopkins is not. I don't know Hopkins personally, but I do know the editor of Counterpunch, and I've known him for a long time. I think he's made a mistake in this matter and a couple of others on similar issues, which suggests that there is a real political discussion there threatening to break out. But unfortunately, it's covered over by the situation that you've been describing, and I'm not sure that the falling out of friends, so to speak, is immediately solvable by in merely personal matters here.
Mm-hmm.
What we're trying to talk about is a situation that is purposely and consciously misrepresented to the American people at large, and to get any clarity on it takes insight and work that we've got to do. The PBS NewsHour last night, which is a standard outlet of mainstream media, spent a long time promoting a book by James B. Stewart called The Deep State. And the book is an attack on the notion that there is a structure, a permanent government, an establishment within the United States that is pursuing political goals that are essentially the ongoing foreign policy and domestic policy of the United States government. As a shorthand, we speak of neoliberalism and neoconservatism. But what the book is trying to do is to scotch the notion that Donald Trump is being manipulated in any way or being forced to speak in various ways as a result of this neoliberal and neoconservative tradition in American politics, somehow manifested by this, quote, deep state, close quote. Now, there's a germ of truth in this, but what it masks is the very real continuity of American policy and the fact that the danger to the American government, to the American political establishment that Donald Trump represents is an attempt, in fact, to alter in any way that policy, that set of policies that have been followed by all recent presidential campaigns. We have to remember that Trump, for all his bombast, became president because he attacked those neoliberal and neoconservative policies that many Americans felt were destroying their life chances. This movement, inchoate as it is spoken of as populism. Trump is the froth on the populist wave, and the heart of that is an objection to American policies on war and the economy that have preoccupied us literally for generations. Now, until we can perhaps describe these matters more accurately, we're at the mercy of people like James B. Stewart, who is telling us that all this deep state stuff is nonsense, of course. Pay no attention to the little man behind the curtain. That what you see is what's happening.
Someone like James B. Stewart seems to me to be the kind of journalist who you sort of bring in. He has this sort of respectable aura about him to tell us how the world really is.
That's right.
From this respectable way. I'm not sure if he writes for the Atlantic or one of the official sort of PMC journals. I mean,
exactly.
If you read these journals, they're telling the 10% professional managerial class how to think about all these issues, how to deal with Trump, how to deal with war, how to deal with Israel-Palestine,
right.
And whether it's the Atlantic or whether it's journals. I don't read these websites so much, but the sense I get is it's like Slate is like that.
Yep.
Salon is like that.
Yes.
Vox is pretty much like that. Vox might be a little bit broader, but these are the things
I
that
don't think so.
the very serious people, the people like us, read to find out how the world works, so that they can get on with their busy professional lives. Pay their mortgages, live in their nice neighborhoods, take their nice vacations, and not worry too much that the world is really going to hell in a handbasket, not only just for 90% of the people, but for the planet itself.
I think that's right. And instead of having a serious, open, and public discussion of these matters, the efforts on the part of our media universe is to make sure that discussion doesn't take place, that the narrative remains in place, and those who are raising critical aspects of it, criticisms of it, are relegated to silence. That's what we're hearing right now, and I must say that's not new, but it's still as virulent a case of thought control as I've seen in America in my lifetime. And remember, I started with McCarthy. What else is on your agenda?
This is what I'm wanting to. I've got a whole batch of things that we're not going to have time for that have to do with race in a historical context and race in the terms of this 1619 issue that the New York Times is. But let me just to make a point, let me just read this one quote from an interview that Amy Goodman did after recent Democratic debates. She had a segment called "Racism in America is endemic. Democratic candidates vow to confront white supremacy and legacy of slavery." And the excerpts that she took from the Democratic presidential primary debates, which I think had taken place the previous evening, were from four candidates: O'Rourke, Harris, Booker, Castro, who all gave their formulaic understandings of how racist a society we are, and how wonderful it is that we're going to do something about it. And her commenter in the studio was this African American guy, Rashad Robinson, who runs this horrible outfit, Color of Change, absolute identity politics, just the worst. And I think his quote really summarizes how miserable this discourse is. And he was talking about all these wonderful comments that were made by Kamala Harris and et cetera. And he said, I mean, it really is incredible. And it is actually a result of movements, a result of, the narrative change that's been built. Narrative change is about the rules and norms of society, what people see as acceptable, and what people can envision is possible. And on the main stage, inside of a presidential debate, you have candidates talking about very clear policies that are going to impact the black community, but actually talking about the historical context of how we got here, talking about reparations, talking about slavery in very clear ways, using the term white supremacist on the national stage, and talking about white supremacy and white nationalism. I mean, Rashad Robinson goes on, I mean, this is a fundamental change from the sort of rules, the unwritten rules of these debates that used to exist, that you had to talk about race, or you couldn't directly talk about race and be considered a kind of legitimate top-tier candidate. That is a result of how we've moved in this country. It's also the result of, I think, a lot of people waking up to the failures of the left at avoiding these conversations about race. The failures of the left. I wonder who you could talk about. Maybe Bernie Sanders? Yeah. Unfortunately, our opponents talk about race all the time, not in ways that we want them to, but they are talking about race all the time. And so leaving this conversation to our opponents, pretending like we can't talk about solving the ills that are deeply about structural racism without talking about race, is something that I'm so glad that so many candidates are speaking up about. And that Beto O'Rourke's moment was just, I think, his finest moment of the night. Beto O'Rourke had said, racism in America is endemic. It's foundational. We can mark the creation of this country not at the 4th of July, 1776, but August 20th, 1619, when the first kidnapped African was brought to this country, blah, blah, blah. There's a whole problematic aspect to this argument that the New York Times is making about 1619 and these articles they're publishing about our historical understanding of race and slavery as the foundation of the American economic system that is being rightly critiqued by people like John Clegg on Jacobin, and so this is just what Rashad Robinson said is just not what the PMC wants to hear. It is just identity politics. It's fluffed up. It's gussied up, but it's identity politics. And no, the Democratic Party is indeed, the manner in which they're dealing with race just reflects the manner in which they're dealing with, except for Bernie Sanders, dealing with everything else. They're not confronting the neoliberal, neoconservative order. They're not challenging the structures of power. They're not challenging exploitation. They're not understanding capitalism. They're just not doing that. And it's perfectly predictable, like someone like Rashad Robinson on Amy Goodman is sort of prettifying all this ridiculous discourse.
I'm trying to summarize.
Okay.
That's always difficult.
We've got 5 minutes or maybe 4 minutes left here.
Identity politics has some very good things to say for it. It's fundamentally opposed to discrimination in this society, and one can hardly deny that there's discrimination in this society. Now, one may have the impression that the people most enthusiastic about identity politics have gone out of their way to create visions of discrimination that may not exactly compare well with reality. But the fact of the matter is, the opposition to discrimination is a good thing. We should not have a discriminating society. But the problem is, identity politics begins by saying that our political problems are based fundamentally in discrimination, and that's not true. Our political problems are based fundamentally in exploitation, the exploitation of the work of mind and hand of everyone in this society for the profits of a few. That is the heart of the matter, and when American politics approaches that issue, as it did faintly in the days of the New Deal, the reaction is very serious indeed. The defense of exploitation is far more successful, perhaps, than the defense of discrimination. But identity politics says ignore the former exploitation and attend perhaps over carefully to the latter. That's the general political situation we find ourselves in, and we're not going to get very far without recognizing that and recognizing the difference in understanding the source of war and economic unrest, so to speak, in exploitation rather than in discrimination.
And it would help to understand history, so I'm just going to at least leave you with this reference for those who care. There's a lot of articles about this. This is an ongoing historical debate, but one that I found particularly helpful was the aforementioned Benjamin Studebaker. Cotton is not what made the United States rich. Okay, cotton is not what made the United States rich. So there's a whole historical background that's just being whiffed on here, that is being put over by Harvard historians, Carl, on the population. And
I think we have to talk about these people.
We need to talk about these people.
I've been doing that for years.
Yeah, we need to talk about these people.
Harvard historians next week on News from Neptune.
Yeah, we'll leave. It's nice to leave with a kind of cliffhanger, like what are these guys going to say about Harvard historians?
You have been watching News from Neptune for the 41st week of 2019, an ending U.S. war, ? Edition. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett. See the research notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.